On March 5th, 1953, Joseph Stalin, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, going way back to 1922, and also the self-proclaimed Generalissimo of the Red Army during World War II, he died. The absence of such an all-powerful figure from the governing scene was bound to have an impact not only on the Soviet Union itself, but also on those territories, especially in Central Europe, territories, countries, East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania, which had since World War II come under Soviet domination. Now, no sooner had his funeral ended than the top Soviet leaders began to criticize Stalin and to struggle among themselves for control of the party and the governing apparatus. Much fault was leveled at Stalin's one-man dictatorship. So the cult of personality, which certainly grew up around Stalin in the years immediately after World War II. And so the new approach adopted was collective leadership. Collective leadership. In some ways, this is as in royal or imperial societies after the death of the king or the emperor, there's an interregnum, a period of time before a new king or a new ruler comes into his own. And in some ways, we can look at the immediate death of one Soviet leader at this time as the beginning of an interregnum, and with, in this case, the argument being collective leadership is the best way, not just one person. So we have people like Malenkov, Molotov, Lavrentii, Beria, and a man named Nikita Khrushchev. Despite the lip service paid to collective leadership, it became increasingly clear that this Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, who was Stalin's former trusted lieutenant that had actually headed the Ukrainian Communist Party of Soviet Ukraine, from 1938 to 1949. It became clear within a couple of years that he was consolidating further and further his power among the so-called collective leadership. Now, Stalin's successors, whether it's Khrushchev and then his successor, were concerned with consolidating the party's control over the country and with trying to balance economic development, balance it in the sense that heavy industrial sector, which was always given emphasis, would not completely overshadow the agricultural and consumer aspects of the economy. In political matters, there was an attempt, in particular under Khrushchev, to limit the excessive controls over all aspects of society that had characterized Stalin's rule, in particular during his last years. And so Khrushchev's era, which he really came into his own in 1958, and until he departed in 1964, at least that era was marked by a period of what is known as a thaw. So we had the cold frozen system, and now we're thawing it a bit, warming it up. and that was accompanied by a relative, and this is all the adjective relative here is quite important, a relative liberalization in political and cultural affairs, and that was also combined with experimentation in the economy and especially in agriculture. And we'll see what that implied in a moment. Now, because the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was an integral part of the Soviet Union, the developments in Ukraine were, not surprisingly, affected by changes at the center in Moscow. As part of this general attack on Stalinist rule, by the way, it came to a climax during Khrushchev's alleged secret speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. That secret speech took place in February 1956. It was leaked the following day, so much for the secret. Very strong criticism of Stalin and his rule. And therefore, after that famous speech of February 1956, it became permissible to criticize Stalin's Russification policies toward the country's national minorities, as well as many other of his policies. And so we have, in a sense, de-Stalinization. You know, we're always getting rid of something, dekulakization. And now we have de-Stalinization. And among the aspects of de-Stalinization were concessions to Soviet Ukraine, but at the same time, also emphasizing elements that would show Ukraine's dependence, or Ukrainians' dependence on their older brother, the Russians. But among those kind of concessions, and I'm calling them that, in February, the 1954 is a key date here, the Crimean Oblast, which actually was just an oblast, a region within the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic going back to 1921, it was now made an autonomous republic, and it was given as a quote-unquote token of friendship of the Russian people to Soviet Ukraine. By the way, the population of this now new territory of Soviet Ukraine had traditionally, as we saw in one of our lectures on the other peoples of Ukraine, traditionally been inhabited by Crimean Tartars. Their percentage decreased. So in the beginning of Soviet rule, it was 25%. Then at the end of the 1930s, it was down to 19%. And now it was 0. There were no more Tatars, Crimean Tartars in Crimea. Why? Because Stalin decided that at the end of World War II, when he was singling out people to blame, he just simply picked up and deported the entire Crimean Tatar population to Central Asia in May 1944. But so now we have Crimea as part of Soviet Ukraine. The other element was in 1954, was a decision to commemorate the 300th anniversary of the agreement of Pereyaslav. What is that and why? Well, Pereyaslav was an agreement, some would say treaty, in 1654 when the Zaporozhian Cossacks pledged their allegiance to the Tsar of Muscovy, which then was the first step toward the gradual incorporation of Ukrainian lands into first the Tsardom of Muscovy, then the Russian Empire, and Soviet Union, which proclaimed itself as the successor. And Of course, they described this as reunification, that lands had been torn away by foreign powers and now were being brought back in 1654. So this Pereyaslav was needed to be embedded in the public thinking, the national psyche, if you will, as one of the foremost symbols of Soviet Ukrainian political mythology. Why? Because it ostensibly proved the old age brotherly love that Ukrainians had for Russians and exemplified the general Marxist-Leninist proletarian principle of the friendship among peoples. And so this was celebrated in a massive way with all kinds of lectures and publications, operas written specifically about Khmelnytsky and all of this, etc. This was kind of the beginning of the thaw under Khrushchev. In the following years of this so-called thaw, witnessed several amnesties for political and other prisoners, the establishment of the first permanent Soviet-Ukrainian mission to the United Nations in New York. I mean, it was a member of the United Nations already from 1945. Now they had their separate mission, separate from the Soviet one. Also, there was a steady increase in the percentage of ethnic Ukrainians in the Communist Party of Ukraine. Went up to 60% as a whole, and 75% of the Central Committee by 1958 were ethnic Ukrainians. And finally, the central government in Moscow began to relax its strictly regimented control over culture. And the result was a wave of scholarly works, literary production that no longer had to rigidly conform to the accepted interpretations in the case of the arts, socialist, realist, artistic dogma. The result of this, again, relative liberal attitude in Ukraine was the appearance of works by several younger writers, and a whole slew of them, poets Symonenko, Lina, Kostenko, Ivan Drach. These writers came to be known as the Sixties group, Шестидесятники, the Sixties group. The writers that were associated with this 60s group, diverse, even generationally diverse, but they were unified in one thing: the rejection of socialist realism as the guiding ideology of literary production, and instead they reaffirmed the principle that belles-lettres, literatures, especially poetry, was basically an expression of the individual. And their writings also implicitly as well as explicitly sought to renew traditional Ukrainian cultural values and to restore the Ukrainian language, which had been so distorted during the Stalinist era, with its increasingly pronounced policy of Russification, including Russified words or Russian words entering Ukrainian vocabulary. This is what was taught in schools. So there was a reaction now to this. In a cultural atmosphere that stressed, in a sense, the reclamation of the past for the spiritual regeneration of Ukrainians in the present, it's not surprising that historians also played an active role during this era of the Khrushchev thaw. History, of course, being a matter of, I've always said, of state, very important. How people must be taught what they need to be taught to remember. And the Ukrainian historical profession got for the first time a historical journal. It was published by the Institute of History of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, a whole host of other publications dealing with history. Other areas of Ukrainian scholarship were also affected by this new environment, and in particular, the need for reference works to emphasize the achievements of Ukrainian culture. And so just between 1959 and 1965 appears the first Ukrainian language encyclopedia, 17 volumes, then a smaller 3-volume general encyclopedia, 4-volume historical encyclopedia specifically, a 26-volume detailed description of each oblast or region of Ukraine, a 6-volume history of Ukrainian art, an 8-volume history of Ukrainian literature. All of this during this relatively short period of the late 60s, early 70s. This concern with producing general reference and synthetic works, all in the Ukrainian language, and about all aspects of Ukrainian culture, also emphasized the pressing need for a standard multi-volume dictionary of what? The instrument in which these publications are coming out. We need a dictionary of the Ukrainian language, a serious one that had begun in the 1920s, but it was cut off in 1929 during the beginning of the end of the Ukrainianization process. Now it's begun again. And finally, between 1970 and 1980, an 11-volume dictionary of the Ukrainian language was published, and that was followed by a 2-volume dictionary of the Old Ukrainian language. This Ukrainian cultural renaissance, if you will, of the late 1950s, early 1960s, and into the very early 70s, also affected the arts, whether painting, decorative design, music, cinema. One Ukrainian film at the time called Shadows of Forgotten Ancestors won international awards in Europe. While this post-Stalin thaw had, as we've just seen from these brief comments, a profound effect on the renewal of Ukrainian cultural life, not surprisingly, it was the economic sphere that had always been and still remained of greatest importance to the Soviet leadership under Khrushchev. We spoke about this post-war economic recovery during the 4th and 5th five-year plans from 1945 to 1955, and how during that period witnessed a doubling of industrial productivity over the pre-war levels. But after 1955, and this was an incredible spurt, the economy began to level off. It's true that and again, perhaps not surprisingly, the trends of the first post-war decade were continued. Still emphasis on heavy industry at the expense of light industry and consumer goods. A continued expansion of the industrial base in Western Ukraine, which we saw, those lands that were incorporated into the Soviet Ukraine after 1945, especially in Lviv, Galicia. And more than a 1/3 rise in the workforce. Now, while the industrial sector more or less held its own after 1955, Ukrainian agriculture continued to be problematic and actually worsened. course, there were erratic weather conditions, insufficient capital investment. And as a result of this, there was a lot of agricultural experimentation, in particular Khrushchev. Khrushchev was determined to correct agricultural deficiencies. He had, during his rule, had come to the United States. He spoke before the United Nations, head of the Soviet delegation. Eisenhower was president of the United States at the time, and they gave him a tour, a mini tour of the United States, and they took him to, I believe it was Iowa, which is like pure, flat land with a lot of corn. And he saw the richness of all of this corn. Wow. This is now the solution to the agricultural problem in Ukraine. And among then he comes back, and among the experiments or the quote-unquote reforms, first of all, those old machine and tractor stations in 1958 were abolished in 1958. They proved to be impractical. They sold the equipment to the collective farms. But then there was an enormous increase in the areas planted with corn. So we have now the corn fever. Increased by 600% between 1953 and 1959. So that at the height of the so-called corn fever, by 1963, as much as 31% of Ukraine's arable land was planted with corn. Ukraine has to become far superior to Iowa. Now, overall, these experiments carried out by Khrushchev failed. He also tried to open up virgin lands that weren't really suitable to agriculture, as in Kazakhstan, neighboring Kazakhstan. The result of this yielded low quality results, crops, harvests. And since the corn that was sown in Ukraine, it was successful, by the way. They got a lot of corn. However, it was basically used for fodder to feed animals. What was the result? Severe food shortages, that is, for humans. Had enough to feed the animals, but now we didn't have enough to feed the humans. The situation actually became so critical that by 1963, the Soviet Union undertook the unprecedented act of importing grain from abroad. Now, you couldn't import it from the United States. This would be embarrassing. So where did they get the grain from? You guessed it. All of those mills out in British Columbia were supplying Soviet ships so that there wouldn't be starvation. The failure of Khrushchev's agricultural experiments, combined with his contribution to another problem, there was growing tension between the Soviet Union and China, both communist brotherly nations. They had problems, even led to some military conflicts along the Chinese shooting war, along the Chinese-Soviet border. All of this was too much for the Central Committee of the All-Soviet Communist Party. And in October 1964, Khrushchev was removed as head of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and head of the government. And now we're back to the quote-unquote interregnum, and in keeping with the principle of collective leadership, we saw how that happened right after Stalin's death. So now, after Khrushchev is retired, he in turn was replaced by not 4, as with Stalin, but 2 of his own former proteges. One was a man named Leonid Brezhnev, and the other, Alexei Kosygin, who was responsible primarily for foreign affairs. So now we have 2. Khrushchev headed the party, Kosygin headed the government. Now, this facade of collective leadership, it was initially maintained, but it was not long before it was this Leonid Brezhnev who became the dominant political force. And so now we're back to one person. Under Brezhnev's rule, which lasted from the late 60s through the 70s up until his death in 1982, so it's basically the late 60s and the entire 70s. During this period, the experiments that were initiated by Khrushchev, whether in the economic or the cultural spheres, came to an end. The only innovation came in foreign affairs. Here, Brezhnev was a strong advocate of what was known as détente, the French word détente, that is to lessen what? Lessen tensions that had built up during the Cold War between the United States or the West and the Soviet Union. But at the same time that was going on in foreign affairs, there was internally within the Soviet Union an increasingly marked trend toward a return to Stalinist-like rigid bureaucratic control, without the excesses of Stalin, but nonetheless control of all aspects of Soviet society. With regard to the nationalities within the Soviet Union, this meant the reimposition of strict or even stricter party controls over all aspects of Soviet life, and that included cultural expression. And therefore, the almost 2 decades of the Brezhnev era, from 1964 to his death in late 1982, witnessed increasing limitations on any Ukrainian cultural activity that was not in strict accord with general Soviet policy. And what was that policy? That is, as pertaining to Soviet society. Well, in short, that policy consisted of, let us say, 3 concepts. Расцвет, or flowering, Zbliženie, drawing together, Slianie, merger, or fusion. Well, what did this mean? Расцвет referred to the flowering of the individual national culture. So we have to encourage their increase. And they're putting emphasis on their cultural specificity. But that would be followed by, all of this is theoretical, as you can imagine, that would be followed by Zbliženie. That is, each of these individual cultures would be influenced by the others during this process of flowering. And so this was a period in which there was an incredible amount of translations from one language to another. So you had all of these Georgian poets or Tajik poets or whatever translated into Ukrainian and vice versa to get to know each other. And then finally, the result of all of this would be Slianie, that is, the merger of all national cultures into one new revolutionary Soviet culture. Of course, there was the question of time frame, namely, when would this Slianie or merger take place? And of course, Khrushchev was always making announcements. It's going to take place in such and such a year. By such and such a year, all this process is going to be finished. In the end, the idea of a merger which would eliminate national distinctions and result in the emergence of one kind of Soviet nation, as it was called, Sovietska Natsiya, was replaced by the more ambiguous notion of, quote-unquote, a new historical community of people, or the Soviet people, Sovietsky Narod. The Homo Sovieticus, the Soviet person. Certainly during the last years of Khrushchev's leadership and the early years of Brezhnev's rule, that is, when this goal of merger was still considered the ideal, the increasing activity of nationalities in the direction of greater cultural distinctiveness, this was perceived as a danger. Yes, you develop the cultures, but you have to make sure they're in relation to everything else and not emphasize something specific, too specific. Now that was perceived as a danger. And so the same Khrushchev, whose actions resulted in this period of thaw, or quote-unquote liberalization, the beginnings of a cultural renaissance in Ukraine. Well, that same period also revived the merger theory in the nationality question, and this was to result in new restrictions on the specificity of national cultures. And so already by 1963, this 60s group of writers, they're now being accused by party ideologists, Communist Party ideologists, of flirting with decadent Western artistic notions. And even worse, being accused of Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism. And as a result of this, some of these people stopped publishing. Well, they couldn't publish because there were restrictions by the censor. So they wrote for themselves or didn't write at all. But if they wrote for themselves, then they kind of distributed their manuscripts in several copies. You always had that carbon paper, so when you were typing something, you had a lot, 3 or 4 copies. And these got now get distributed. And this became to be known as Sam Vydav in Ukrainian, or Samizdat in Russian, that is self-published, illegally produced and distributed literature. Sam Vydav or Samizdat. And the people who were producing these works and reading them and discussing them, all in private obviously, never in public, came to be known as dissidents, those who were displeased, to say the least, with what was going on in Soviet society. And their activity continued, underground cultural activity continued. But it turns out that a lot of their writings got published in a neighboring socialist, communist country, Czechoslovakia, where there was a Ukrainian minority publishing house, and either was published in Czechoslovakia during this period, or those manuscripts were sent farther west clandestinely, and they reached West Germany, in particular Munich, which was a center of anti-Soviet Ukrainian activity. And all of this, because these materials came to the attention of the West, and some of them were translated into English, caused embarrassment for the Soviet leadership. Why embarrassment? Well, because, remember, at the very same time, Brezhnev was trying to lessen international tensions through this policy of détente. and to make the Soviet Union look like a responsible member of the world community of states. But concern about the negative or potential negative opinion in the West and among the world communist movement was outweighed by what Soviet authorities felt was the need to combat the dangers of budding Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism within its borders. And therefore, a series of arrests took place in Ukraine in 1965-66, and again in 1971-72. And so, what do we have? A little more than a decade after Stalin's death, and the specter of political trials once again was on the agenda. In this atmosphere of a new wave of arrests and political trials that took place in Ukraine in 1965 and 1966, the accused now were these dissident intellectuals whose only real crime was that they remained outspoken in their criticism of the Soviet system. So we have a whole group of these people, some of them former Sixtiers, Ivan Zyuba, Yevhen Svestyuk. Even a Soviet journalist, loyalist, a man named Vyacheslav Chornovil. He was, as a loyalist, he was sent to cover the earliest trials, but then he became convinced that this was a violation, and so he became now a dissident. And all of these people were sentenced to various terms in prison. In 1971-72, another series of arrests and trials took place. And these affected not only those dissidents who were active in the underground self-publishing Sam Vidav Samizdat movement, but also scholars and cultural activists who, during the 1960s, had been in the forefront of the Ukrainian cultural revival. And this last major government crackdown in Ukraine coincided with the removal in May of the first secretary of the Communist Party of Ukraine, a man named Petro Shelest. So while Brezhnev was head of the All-Union Party, Shelest head of the Communist Party of Ukraine. By the way, this Shelest was the very same person who, since his rule began in 1963, had overseen the crackdown on Ukrainian intellectuals. Now it was his turn. And whatever the real reason for Shelest's removal, perhaps he was demoted because of his hard-line views on foreign policy. He didn't agree with Brezhnev, détente. Of course, local rivalries among party leaders, or considered his ineffectiveness in controlling the dissidents. Whatever the real reasons, publicly, Shelest, even while he was still had his seat a few months longer in the Politburo, the central leadership of the all-Soviet Communist Party, Bolshevik. In any case, he was accused of being the author of a popular book called Our Soviet Ukraine. Our Soviet Ukraine. It was published in 1970. And now this book was ostensibly laden with, quote-unquote, local nationalism, national narrow-mindedness. It put too much emphasis on the Zaporozhian Cossacks. Also, at the very same time, many of the revisionist historians were being removed from their posts. Now, the public explanation for Shelest's removal sent a clear signal that the Soviet authorities were determined to put an end to the expression of any ideas that might stress Ukraine's cultural and administrative distinctiveness from the rest of Soviet society. And it didn't make a difference whether such ideas came from the pens of belletrists or dissidents or scholars or even the head of the Ukrainian Communist Party. These arrests and trials of Ukrainian dissidents and the pressures that were applied to other cultural activists revealed the dilemma that the nationality question had always been for Soviet rulers and now continued to face the present Soviet authorities under, in this case, Brezhnev's leadership. Now, it's true, the dissidents were imprisoned, and on more than one occasion. Some of them, people like Valentin Moroz, Plyushch, Pyotr Grigorenko, all were, or these three were even forcibly exiled to the West. Sometimes they made some kind of deal. They were picked up from somewhere in Siberia and put on a plane and sent to Zurich or Paris or wherever. But none of them, even those, the vast majority who were in prison somewhere in the Soviet Union, were not physically liquidated, as most likely would have occurred under Stalin. And neither were the Soviet authorities able during the 1970s to silence these characters. These recalcitrants who seemed almost to welcome their role as martyrs in a struggle for what they considered a patriotic duty towards their Ukrainian cultural and national heritage. I mean, if you didn't sit somewhere for several years, then you weren't a real patriot. And sitting, you know where I'm talking about, we're sitting. On the other hand, by the early 1980s, there also seemed to occur a kind of cultural détente, a cultural détente between the central government and those writers and intellectuals who were able and willing to work on behalf of Ukrainian culture within Soviet guidelines. And so some of the directors of institutes who had carried out the post-Shelest cultural purges of the 1970s, they were replaced. Several writers who had been harassed for their unorthodox work, among them even people of the Sixtiers group, Lina Kostenko and Ivan Drach, they now were allowed to publish once again and even become the objects of Soviet awards. In a sense, the situation during the last decade of Brezhnev's rule resembled Russian-ruled Ukraine a century before. Like their 19th century counterparts, who pursued Shevchenko's policy of practice of mutually exclusive national identities, these late 20th century dissidents, like their forebears, represented only a tiny minority of Ukraine's population. For instance, one estimate identified at most 975 individuals who were active between 1960 and 1972. And of course, that was out of a population of 48 million. At the same time, one must note that the vast majority of Ukraine's inhabitants, relatively better off economically than ever before, and most importantly, spared from foreign invasion now for more than a third of a century. This was because of the protective shield of Soviet military might. This majority was probably satisfied to operate within a system that, in nationality terms, reflected a hierarchy of multiple loyalties, the other possibility, and that meant that it remained possible to be simultaneously a Ukrainian and a Soviet citizen. And while a Ukrainian identity and cultural framework was acceptable in most circumstances, higher forms of cultural and educational endeavors had to be carried out in the universal Soviet medium, Russian. Now, there was at least one crucial difference with this analogy between the late 19th and late 20th centuries. Whereas in the past, being a little Russian often led to complete national assimilation, being a Soviet Ukrainian did not necessarily lead to such a result. Despite the actual dominance of Russian forms in Soviet Ukrainian political, social, and cultural life, including an increase in the number of Russian language schools and publications, the encouragement of bilingualism in elementary schools. Despite all of this, the Soviet system had at the same time produced a highly educated and conscious Ukrainian stratum of the population. And also because of socio-demographic change, it was now the cities and not the villages which became the carriers of the Ukrainian ethnos. And despite superficial observations that Russians seem to dominate in Ukrainian cities, the fact of the matter is that Ukrainians actually continue to increase in number in Ukraine's urban areas, especially in so symbolic a center as Kiev. And on top of that, the result of living in this urban environment was not assimilation, but rather a sharpening of ethnic awareness. And so, the existence of a highly educated and urban element seemed to assure the persistence of a nationally conscious and articulate stratum of Ukraine's population, from which dissidents, national patriots, believers in mutually exclusive national identities, whatever they may be called, but they would continue to be around and increase. This then was the situation by the time when the 80-year-old Brezhnev, some would say, finally died in 1982. Alongside the improvement or the deportation of outspoken dissidents and the seeming malaise or stagnation in Ukrainian cultural life and education, there nonetheless remained the potential for renewal among the Ukrainian population as a whole, should the political situation ever change and the patriotic intelligentsia be given the opportunity to function more freely. That opportunity did indeed seem to come with the ascendance in 1985 to the highest post in the Soviet leadership of an otherwise little-known Communist Party functionary, Mikhail Gorbachev. And it is to that story and his impact that we will turn when we return for our last lecture.